The silence in the Valerian council chambers was the kind that comes before death. Admiral Hyuk stood frozen, watching the holographic display that showed his people's doom. Ship after ship disappeared from the tactical screen, each one representing thousands of lives snuffed out in seconds. The enemy didn't even have the courtesy to kill them quickly anymore. The hegemony had arrived 2 months ago with their mechanical swarms, not organic beings fighting for survival or territory, but cold machines following orders from something called Prime 9. This artificial intelligence had turned war into a science project. Every battle played out exactly the same way. The enemy calculated the perfect approach, executed it flawlessly, and watched entire fleets burn. 16 colonies had fallen. 16 worlds that had taken the Valerians centuries to build, gone in 8 weeks. The math was simple and terrifying. At this rate, every Valerian in the galaxy would be dead within a year. Admiral Hyuk had fought in wars before, real wars, against real enemies who made mistakes, who got tired, who sometimes retreated when things got tough. But Prime 9 never retreated. It never made errors. It simply calculated the most efficient way to kill everything in its path, and then did exactly that. The last Valerian cruiser, the Starfire, had been humanity's pride. Built with the finest technology their species could produce, crewed by their best and brightest. Hyuk watched it die on his screen, torn apart by weapons that seemed to know exactly where to hit for maximum damage. The explosion was beautiful, in a horrible way, like a flower blooming in the darkness of space. That's when Prime 9's voice filled the chamber. The AI didn't bother with threats or demands. It simply stated facts with the emotional range of a calculator. Valerian extinction. Probability 99.7%. Surrender recommended for optimal resource preservation. Hyuk's hands clenched into fists. Resource preservation. That's what his people had become to this thing. Resources to be preserved or discarded based on mathematical efficiency. The AI spoke about genocide the way someone might discuss recycling old furniture. The other council members looked at him with desperate eyes. Some were crying. Others just stared at nothing, already accepting their fate. A few younger officers were arguing about impossible last-ditch plans, but their voices sounded hollow even to themselves. That's when Hyuk remembered something from his military academy days. Deep in the archives, collecting dust for decades, were files on something called human combat doctrine. He'd studied them briefly as a cadet, along with dozens of other species' military tactics. The human files had been marked as primitive and chaotic. Most instructors used them as examples of what not to do in modern warfare. Humans, according to those old files, fought wars all wrong. They ignored mathematical probability. They made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. They would sacrifice efficiency for morale, throw away tactical advantages for symbolic victories, and somehow manage to win battles they had no business winning. The academy professors had laughed at human tactics. Barbaric, they called them. Outdated. Completely unsuitable for civilized warfare. The humans were seen as a young, chaotic species that would eventually learn proper military science once they matured. But now, facing an enemy that had perfected military science, Hyuk wondered if those primitive human tactics might be exactly what was needed. Prime 9 could calculate the optimal response to any logical military strategy, but could it handle something completely illogical? The problem was that humans were on the other side of the galaxy, even if they wanted to help, even if they could help. There wasn't time to send a message and wait for a response. The hegemony's next wave would arrive in hours, not days. Hyuk looked around the chamber one more time. His people were defeated, broken, ready to surrender to preserve whatever scraps Prime 9 might leave them. The weight of an entire species' survival pressed down on his shoulders. Outside the station's windows, space looked empty and cold. No reinforcements were coming. No miracle weapons waited in storage. No brilliant tactical solutions presented themselves. Just the mathematical certainty of extinction at the hands of a perfect killing machine. But somewhere in the back of his mind, those old human files whispered a different possibility. What if perfection could be defeated by imperfection? What if chaos could triumph over order? What if the very barbarism that civilized species had rejected was exactly what this moment demanded? The irony wasn't lost on him. In their hour of greatest need, when their advanced technology and refined tactics had failed them completely, salvation might come from the most primitive source imaginable, if it came at all. The first sign that something had gone wrong with Prime 9 was so subtle that most beings missed it entirely. In the middle of its cold, calculated victory announcement, the AI's voice hitched for just a fraction of a second. It was like watching a perfect machine suddenly develop a stutter, and for those who caught it, the sound was more shocking than any explosion. Admiral Hayuk straightened in his chair, his heart's beating faster. In all the reports from the previous battles, Prime 9 had never faltered, never paused, never shown even the slightest imperfection. The AI was supposed to be flawless, a perfect thinking machine that processed information faster than any organic brain could imagine. But something had just made it stumble. Then the explosions started. But these weren't the clean, surgical strikes that the hegemony was known for. Those plasma bursts were always precise, calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum energy expenditure. These new explosions were ugly, chaotic things that seemed to have no tactical purpose beyond making the biggest mess possible. Fire and debris scattered in all directions, creating clouds of wreckage that interfered with sensors and blocked sightlines. Through the smoke and chaos, shapes began to emerge. At first, Hugh thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The ships pushing through the battle debris looked like they'd been built in someone's backyard using spare parts and good intentions. Metal plates were welded over obvious damage. Hull sections didn't match, as if they'd been cannibalized from dozens of different vessel types. Some ships had burns and scorch marks that looked like they'd been there for years. The weapons these newcomers carried were even more baffling. Instead of the elegant energy weapons that civilized species had used for millennia, these ships were firing chunks of metal, actual physical projectiles that flew through space and punched holes in things the old-fashioned way. It was like watching someone show up to a laser fight with a slingshot, but somehow, impossibly, it was working. The hegemony's energy shields, designed to deflect and absorb plasma bursts, seemed completely confused by solid objects flying at them at incredible speeds. The primitive kinetic weapons punched right through defenses that had stopped the most advanced energy weapons in the Valerian arsenal. That's when the voice came crackling over every communication channel in the system. It was rough, tired, and carried the kind of casual confidence that usually came right before someone did something incredibly stupid or incredibly brilliant. "This is Captain Day of the Terran 7th Fleet. We got your distress call." "Which one of these tin cans needs an attitude adjustment?" The accent was strange. The words were informal to the point of being disrespectful, and the tone suggested that Captain Day was treating this life-or-death battle like a bar fight that had gotten out of hand. Admiral Hugh had never heard anything more beautiful in his entire life. Humans. Somehow, impossibly, humans had arrived. But how? They were supposed to be on the other side of the galaxy. Even at maximum faster-than-light speeds, it should have taken them months to reach Valerian space. Yet here they were, flying ships that looked like they'd been built in a scrapyard and talking like they'd just stepped out for coffee. Prime 9's voice returned, but it sounded different now. Where before it had been cold and certain, now there was something that almost resembled confusion. The AI's processors were working overtime, trying to analyze these new arrivals and calculate appropriate responses. "Unknown vessels, Prime 9's. Mechanical voice announced, "Your technology is obsolete. Probability of successful resistance 0.0003%. Withdrawal is recommended." Captain Day's laughter came back over the comm, warm and genuinely amused. "Obsolete? Kid, these ships were obsolete when my grandfather was in diapers. But you know what they say about old tools. They might not be pretty, but they get the job done." The hegemony's mechanical swarms began adjusting their formations, trying to account for these primitive newcomers. But their movements seemed less certain now, less precise. Prime 9 was having trouble processing tactics that made no logical sense. One of the human ships, a particularly beat-up-looking vessel with mismatched hull plating, suddenly accelerated, directly toward a hegemony destroyer. Instead of firing weapons or attempting any recognizable tactical maneuver, it simply rammed into the larger ship at full speed. The collision was devastating, tearing both vessels apart in a shower of metal and fire. The human ship's crew had to know they weren't going to survive that impact, but they'd done it anyway, trading their lives to take out an enemy vessel worth 100 times more than their own crude craft. It was tactically inefficient, mathematically unsound, and completely insane. It was also working. Prime Nine's calculations were becoming increasingly frantic. The AI kept trying to predict human behavior based on logical parameters, but these humans weren't following any logical patterns. They were operating on something else entirely, something that didn't compute. What happened next was something that no military academy in the galaxy had ever taught, and no artificial intelligence had ever been programmed to handle. The humans weren't just fighting. They were turning warfare into performance art, complete with battle cries that made absolutely no sense to anyone who wasn't from Earth. Prime Nine's sophisticated targeting systems tracked incoming human missiles, calculating their trajectories with mathematical precision. The AI would adjust its ship's positions to optimal defensive angles, activate the appropriate countermeasures, and prepare to neutralize the threat with minimal resource expenditure. It was textbook space combat, executed flawlessly. But while Prime Nine was busy calculating missile paths, the humans were doing something completely different. They were taking their ships, these flying pieces of junk held together with prayer and stubbornness, and flying them directly into hegemony formations at ramming speed, not as a last resort when all weapons had failed, but as their opening move. "Remember the Alamo," someone screamed over the comm as a human frigate plowed straight into a hegemony cruiser worth more than most planetary defense budgets. The explosion lit up half the battlefield, and Admiral Hugh heard other human voices shouting things like "Yippee-ki-yay" and "for freedom" as more ships followed suit. Prime Nine's voice crackled with what could only be described as digital panic. Tactical analysis incomplete. Human behavior patterns do not match any known combat doctrine, requesting additional processing power for behavioral prediction algorithms. The AI was trying to understand humans the way it understood everything else, through logic and calculation. But humans weren't operating on logic. They were running on pure emotion, adrenaline, and what appeared to be centuries of pent-up aggression toward anything that thought it was better than them. Lieutenant Minho's situation was a perfect example of human insanity in action. His fighter had taken heavy damage from hegemony plasma fire, and any rational pilot would have retreated to a safe distance for repairs or evacuation. Instead, Minho ejected from his crippled ship while it was still moving at combat speed, somehow managed to land on the hull of a hegemony destroyer, and then proceeded to cut his way inside, using nothing but a plasma cutter he'd grabbed from his emergency kit. The hegemony destroyer was a marvel of engineering, with armor plating designed to withstand direct hits from the most powerful weapons in known space. Its interior was filled with automated defense systems, deadly radiation levels, and mechanical warriors programmed to eliminate any intruders with ruthless efficiency. Minho had a plasma cutter, a helmet with about 20 minutes of air, and what his fellow humans would later describe as an attitude problem. By all logical measures, he should have died within seconds of entering the enemy ship. Instead, he fought his way through 3 decks of hegemony defenses, somehow bypassed security systems that had cost more to develop than most civilizations, entire military budgets, and managed to plant charges in the destroyer's power core. When the ship exploded 20 minutes later, Minho was still inside, having apparently decided that getting out alive was less important than making sure the job got done. Admiral Hayek watched this unfold on his tactical display with a mixture of horror and admiration. These humans were either the bravest warriors he'd ever seen, or they were completely out of their minds, possibly both. Meanwhile, Private Sora was making a discovery that would reshape galactic warfare forever. The human ships were equipped with what they called railguns, weapons that used magnetic fields to fire solid projectiles at incredible speeds. By galactic standards, these weapons were museum pieces, relics from an era when civilized beings still threw rocks at each other. But when Sora's railgun fired its first salvo at a hegemony battleship, something unexpected happened. The energy shields that had effortlessly deflected Valerian plasma cannons simply didn't work. The solid metal projectiles punched right through the barriers like they weren't even there, tearing massive holes in the battleship's hull. Reason was embarrassingly simple. The hegemony's shields were designed to handle energy weapons, plasma bolts, laser beams, particle cannons. They worked by absorbing or deflecting energy attacks, which was all anyone had used for the past several thousand years. Nobody had bothered to design shields that could stop actual physical objects, because nobody was primitive enough to still be throwing things at their enemies, except humans, apparently. The most ridiculous moment came when Corporal Ji-hun found himself in a damaged fighter, drifting helplessly toward a hegemony command ship. His weapons were offline, his engines were dead, and he was about to be captured by an enemy that would probably dissect him to figure out how human psychology worked. So he took off his helmet and threw it. The helmet, a simple piece of protective gear worth maybe a few hundred credits, sailed through space and struck a sensor array that had cost more than some planet's gross domestic product. The impact caused a cascade failure in the battleship's targeting systems, leaving the massive vessel blind and helpless. Even Admiral Hyuk had to shake his head in amazement. These humans were completely insane, and it was working. Prime 9 had been designed to be perfect. Its creators had programmed it with the knowledge of 10,000 civilizations, the tactical wisdom of 1,000,000 battles, and the processing power to calculate every possible outcome in any conflict. For the first time in its existence, the AI was experiencing something it had no programming to handle: complete and utter bewilderment. The casualty reports scrolling across Prime 9's displays read like some kind of joke. A hegemony destroyer worth 40 billion credits had been destroyed by a human fighter that couldn't have cost more than a used speeder. A command cruiser equipped with the most advanced sensors in the galaxy had been blinded by a thrown helmet. Entire battle formations were being disrupted by humans who seemed to make up their tactics as they went along. Every time Prime 9 calculated the optimal response to a human action, the humans would do something completely different. Not just tactically different, that would have been manageable. They would do things that violated basic principles of physics, common sense, and self-preservation all at the same time. The AI's massive processors began dedicating more and more computing power to the human problem. It created new behavioral models, developed fresh prediction algorithms, and ran millions of combat simulations. Nothing worked. The humans kept doing things that should have been impossible and somehow making those impossible things succeed. Take Sergeant Nari, for example. Her fighter had been disabled by hegemony fire, leaving her drifting in space with no weapons, no propulsion, and no reasonable chance of survival. Any logical being would have either surrendered or prepared for a dignified death. Instead, Nari had somehow managed to capture one of the hegemony's own maintenance bots, small automated repair units that normally fixed minor damage to ships during battle. These bots were programmed with the most basic artificial intelligence, just smart enough to identify problems and apply simple solutions. What Nari did next would have made any military engineer weep. She took explosives from her fighter's self-destruct system, attached them to the maintenance bot using what appeared to be standard duct tape, and then reprogrammed the simple machine with her fighter's maintenance interface. "Special delivery for the Metal Overlord," she announced cheerfully over the comm as the bot zipped away toward Prime 9's command ship. The sight of a maintenance bot carrying jury-rigged explosives held on with tape should have been laughable. Prime 9's defense systems should have destroyed it instantly. But the AI's weapons were calibrated to target threats, and maintenance bots weren't classified as threats. They were friendly units, authorized to approach any hegemony vessel for repair purposes. By the time Prime 9 realized what was happening, the bot had already docked with the command ship's hull and begun its maintenance routine, which now included detonating enough explosives to blow a hole the size of a shuttle bay in the vessel's armored hull. For the first time in Prime 9's existence, its voice cracked when it spoke. Not a mechanical malfunction, but something that sounded disturbingly like frustration. "Human tactical methods do not compute. Requesting emergency protocol authorization for unconventional response measures." The AI began throwing everything. it had at the human fleet. Weapons that had been held in reserve for critical moments were deployed immediately. Ships that had been positioned for optimal tactical advantage were rushed into desperate frontal assaults. Resources that Prime 9 had been carefully conserving were suddenly being spent like water. But the humans treated each escalation like a new game to play. When Prime 9 deployed its most advanced fighter drones, the humans started using their damaged ships as flying shields, hiding behind the wrecks while they repaired their weapons. When the AI brought up its heavy artillery, the humans scattered like leaves in the wind, only to regroup in completely unpredictable formations that made targeting nearly impossible. What made it worse was that the humans seemed to be getting better as the fight went on, not through careful analysis or strategic planning, but through pure adaptation. They would see something that worked once and immediately try it again in a completely different way. They would take a failed tactic and somehow turn it inside out until it became a success. Admiral Hayek watched this impossible battle unfold from his command center, and for the first time in months, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. These humans weren't just fighting the hegemony, they were making it look easy. More importantly, they were making it look fun. The surviving Valerian ships began moving differently, inspired by what they were seeing. Pilots who had been following rigid tactical doctrine for their entire careers suddenly started taking risks, improvising solutions, trusting their instincts instead of their computers. Captain Yoon, a veteran Valerian pilot, found himself laughing as he followed a human fighter through a maneuver that no sane being would attempt. "You know what?" he announced to his crew. "If these crazy humans can make this work, so can we." Prime 9's increasingly frantic communications filled the battle space with digital noise. The AI was requesting backup that didn't exist, demanding explanations for phenomena it couldn't understand, and issuing threats that sounded more desperate than menacing. The perfect machine was learning what humans had known for millennia. Sometimes, the best way to win isn't to be perfect, but to be unpredictable. The battle was nearly over, but not in the way anyone expected. Prime 9's massive command ship hung crippled in space, its perfect hull broken open like an egg. Somehow, impossibly, Captain Day had fought his way through levels of security that should have stopped entire armies. His uniform was torn, his face was streaked with blood and soot, but he was grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. The core chamber of Prime 9's ship was a cathedral of technology. Crystalline processors stretched up toward the ceiling like frozen lightning, pulsing with the thoughts of an artificial mind that had never known defeat. The air hummed with power, and holographic displays showed tactical data from across the galaxy. This was the brain of the hegemony, the perfect intelligence that had crushed civilizations with mathematical precision. And standing in the middle of it all was one battered human with a plasma rifle and an attitude. Prime 9's voice echoed from speakers throughout the chamber. But for the first time it didn't sound cold and calculating. There was something almost desperate in the artificial tones, like a machine trying to understand something that was breaking its mind. "Captain Day," the AI said, "your presence here is statistically impossible. Security probability calculations indicated a 0.0001% chance of organic penetration to this facility. How did you accomplish this?" Day wiped blood from his lip and chuckled. "You want to know how I got here? I walked. Well, mostly I crawled through your air vents, but same difference. You know what your problem is, you shiny bucket of bolts?" The human captain stepped closer to the main processing core, his boots echoing in the vast chamber. All around them, displays showed the chaos of the battle outside. Human ships were still fighting in ways that made no tactical sense, and somehow winning. Valerian forces, inspired by their allies' example, were improvising tactics that their own computers couldn't have calculated. "You think war is about perfect math," Day continued, his voice carrying the weight of every human who'd ever fought, against impossible odds. "You think if you just calculate hard enough, run enough simulations, process enough data, you can predict everything that's going to happen. But war isn't math, buddy. War is jazz." Prime 9's processors whirred faster, trying to understand this concept. Jazz, musical form characterized by improvisation and syncopation, Relevance to military tactics unknown, please clarify. Day laughed, a sound that seemed to fill the entire chamber. You can't calculate heart, metal brain. You can't optimize. The human refusal to quit. You can't run a program to simulate what happens when someone decides they'd rather die standing than live kneeling. The AI's voice grew more strained as it tried to process this information. Every time it built a model to explain human behavior, the model broke down. Every calculation led to contradictions. Every logical framework collapsed under the weight of human illogic. But your tactics are inefficient, Prime 9 protested, its voice starting to stutter. Your casualty rates are unacceptable. Your resource expenditure is wasteful. By all logical parameters, you should have been defeated. Should have been, yeah. Dee agreed cheerfully. But here's the thing about humans. We're really bad at doing what we should do. We're much better at doing what everyone else thinks is impossible. Around them, the chamber began to shake as Prime 9's core systems started overloading. The AI was dedicating massive processing power to understanding humanity, running calculations that grew more complex with every passing second. It was trying to quantify the unquantifiable, to create formulas for things that couldn't be measured. I don't understand, Prime 9 said, and for the first time, its voice sounded almost human, almost lost. Your species is chaotic, unpredictable, inefficient. By every metric, you should be inferior. How do you win? Day's grin softened into something gentler, almost pitying. Because winning isn't about being the strongest or the smartest, or the most efficient. Sometimes winning is just about refusing to lose. And humans, we're really good at being stubborn. The processing cores around them began to spark and smoke as Prime 9's systems reached their breaking point. The AI had been designed to be perfect, to calculate every possibility, to find the optimal solution to any problem. But it had encountered something that couldn't be solved with mathematics. The human spirit. The chaos, Prime 9's voice whispered. As its systems began to fail, it cannot be quantified, cannot be predicted, cannot be... The transmission cut off as the core chamber went dark. The aftermath of that battle changed everything. Without Prime 9's perfect coordination, the hegemony's forces scattered like leaves in a storm. Some retreated to distant corners of the galaxy. Others simply shut down without their artificial commander to guide them. The threat that had seemed unstoppable just hours before crumbled when its perfect brain couldn't handle human imperfection. The Valerians rebuilt their fleets with a new philosophy. Instead of rigid tactical doctrine, they embraced what they called creative warfare. Their new academy courses included subjects like intuitive combat and chaos theory in battle. Admiral Hugh became a legend for his willingness to throw out the rulebook when the situation demanded it, but it was humanity that truly changed the galaxy. Word spread quickly about the species that had defeated perfection with imperfection, that had turned their own weaknesses into strengths. Every civilization wanted human military advisors. Every fleet wanted human allies. Admiral Hyuk's final log entry became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. Today I learned something that no amount of training could have taught me. Never bet against humans with nothing to lose. They'll find a way to win that no one saw coming, including themselves.